Start stream.
Start
Yes.
stream. Yes.
Okay, everybody. Welcome to the Atheist Reformation. This is Drew. And also coming in, co-hosting with me today is going to be Michael Lofton from the Reason and Theology channel. We are joined today by Mr. Ryan Merkle out of California, who wants to introduce us to this interesting philosophical project that he's been working on for the last several years called the Quadrant Model of Reality. All right, so Ryan, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the Quadrant Model of Reality.
Hey, so the Quadrant Model of Reality is just a theory that says that existence is organized around the cross. A cross is a fourfold symbol, has four spokes.
Mm-hmm.
So it turns out that there's something called the Quadrant Pattern that's dominant in existence. What this pattern is it's kind of a 3+1 pattern, where I'll just give one example of this pattern would be the four elements. The first one is air. It's kind of ethereal. It's not solid at all. The second one is water. We're moving our way into solid, into the physical. The third one is earth, which now we're in the physical. The third is always the most physical. So the first is more ethereal. The second one is kind of an intermediate. Then we have the solid, the physical, the third one. And then the fourth aspect is fire. Fire is the transcendent one. That's at +1. The fire doesn't fit with the other three. So Empedocles was an ancient philosopher from Greece, and he described these four elements as kind of a 3+1 pattern, where he said that fire was opposed to the first three, where it's almost like the first three are one element, but then fire is different. It doesn't fit with them. So that's that 3+1 pattern. Now there's a fifth element, which would be the ether. So air is according to Aristotle, air is hot and wet. Wet things fill a container, hot things rise. Water is cold and wet. Cold things sink, wet things fill the container. Earth is cold and dry. Cold things sink, and dry things, they maintain a solid form. And then fire, he said, is hot and dry, which hot things, again, they rise, fire rises, but it's dry, so it maintains a form. And then there's the ether, which is hot, cold, wet, and dry. So the fourth is different, but then that fifth is ultra transcendent. And the fifth is actually kind of like God. It's divine. So the way that Aristotle described it was he saw the ether as divine. It made up the stars in the heavens, which they saw as gods. So the fifth is that ultra transcendent aspect. The fourth is transcendent. Now that pattern, you're going to find it everywhere in existence. The cross is expressing itself everywhere in existence. So the thesis is that reality is not randomly organized, that there is a pattern that you see, that there is this form, I call it the form of existence, the cross, which is ubiquitous.
Okay. Now, you'll understand that I would have some interesting questions, or at least I hope they're interesting questions. I'm looking at what I believe is your older website called quadrantmodel.com, and in there I see what looks like a description of the quadrant itself. So it looks like you're describing kind of a quadrant within quadrants, where quadrant 1 says it's the instinctual, primitive, spiritual consciousness. And there's four squares within that, such as sensation, perceptions, response, and awareness, and so on and so forth through groupish consciousness, egoistic, individualistic consciousness. Then you have your transpersonal, your intuitive consciousness, as you describe it, and then you have quadrant 5, which is God outside the quadrant. So now, questions that I have about this one is looking at your examples. We have a few places where this kind of breaks down. For instance, looking at blood types as an example that you give. Well, you also have the rhesus factor within each blood type, positive or negative. So in that regard, you would have 8 blood types and not 4. So you see where I kind of seem to have issue with this. Is this almost looks like it has the potential to be seen as something along the lines of what's called apophenia, which is where the mind makes connections that aren't really there, such as like seeing a shape in the clouds. The cloud didn't order itself in such a way as to show a dog or a house or a heart. It just so happens that that is how it made it, and so our mind looks for that pattern. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in terms of the blood types, the the kind of fundamental model is the ABO blood type model, where there's type A, type B. Those are the first 2 types, and then type AB is the 3rd type, and the 4th type is type O. Mm-hmm. Now, someone with type O blood can give his blood to someone with type A or type B or type AB, which makes the 4th one kind of transcendent. So that's that 3+1 pattern. Now, I understand that there's the rhesus factor.
Right, because so only the O negative is actually a universal donor. That's because it lacks a rhesus factor. O positive can't donate to someone who has a negative or non-existent rhesus factor. So you see where that kind of, it seems to fall apart a bit, at least as an example. And now I'm not saying that that's evidence that everything you're saying is garbage or anything like that. It just, at the end of the day, the reason why I bring people on here is to bash these arguments up against each other, break them apart, shatter them into tiny pieces, and then put them back together, hopefully stronger, so that the next time a person comes back, we see a more nuanced, a better form of argumentation. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's pretty funny because a lot of times when I share the quadrant model, that's the first one that people bring up is the blood type one, and they've mentioned the rhesus factor example. And there's a lot of things where, I'll give another example, would be the Platonic solids. Plato said that there were 5 Platonic solids: the tetrahedron, the cube, the icosahedron, the octahedron, and the dodecahedron. Now, people would say, okay, there's 5. The way that he organized them was he said that the first 4 are related to the first 4 elements, and the 5th one's related to ether again. So, but one of them is a tetrahedron, which has 4 sides. Okay, the tetrahedron, you're going to see it everywhere. Tetra's 4. Now, all I'm saying is, I'm not saying that every single thing has to fit the pattern exactly, but you're going to find this pattern in so many places that it's not coincidental. So just the fact that the ABO blood type model how it fits that 3+1 aspect in its primitive form, in that fundamental form, that's all I'm trying to point out, is that pattern is expressing itself. Okay. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lot of examples that don't fit that pattern, but that pattern is dominant, and it can't be a coincidence that pattern shows itself in so many places. And I'm saying it's not a coincidence.
Okay. So I see what you're saying there about saying it's not a coincidence that you don't think that it's an issue of apophenia or seeing a connection where none exists. But I do have to ask a question, especially in reference to the Platonic solids. Now, you brought up the tetrahedron. Yes, it's true that it does have 4 sides, and I guess I could see where you might have a point with them if, say, all the Platonic solids had sides or faces in multiples of 4. And we see that with the tetrahedron and the octahedron. So those are 2 multiples of 4. But with the cube, it's 6 faces. With the dodecahedron, it's 12, which, granted, it does become a multiple of 4. And then the icosahedron, that one's what, 20? But you see the cube doesn't seem to really fit that model. So which out of those 5 would be your, for lack of a better term, your outside of the norm, your God quadrant?
So the way that Aristotle described it, or I think it was Plato described them, was the icosahedron is water. I think because it's so just its shape, it somehow reflected the qualities of water. Tetrahedron, I guess, was fire, because I guess maybe its jagged points kind of reminded him of fire. Then the air, I think, was, or Earth was the cube. Air was
Okay,
I could look it
but
up.
I see the general point that you're trying to make with that.
So the point I'm going to get at there is, yeah, that there's five, but he's relating them to to the 3+1, the four elements, which are the 3+1, and that ultra transcendent fifth.
Okay, but I guess kind of the question that I would have at that point is, at the end of the day, when you look at not necessarily the Platonic solids, but say the four elements as prescribed by the ancient Greeks, what does that really matter, considering that we know that these aren't actually elements at all?
Mm-hmm.
Elements are what's on the periodic table of science, and fire is a result of interactions between these elements. The same as with air and water, and even earth. At this point, everything is made of these base compounds of elements that are indeed much smaller, more basic and rudimentary than what Aristotle or Plato was exploring back 2,000 years ago, 2,000 plus years ago. Excuse me.
Yeah. So there was a kind of a revolution in science, I guess, where they kind of understood that the elements aren't, or everything isn't built around those four elements, that there's a periodic table. And I think when that revolution first started, I'm pretty sure the guy's name was Lavoisier, but he still divided the elements into four groups, which is interesting, and he divided them into a 3+1 pattern. So my point is that we're going to see that 3+1 pattern being dominant, and then even today, the periodic table is divided into four groups: the S group, the P group, the D group, and the F group. And the F group is different. So it's based off of orbitals. So an S orbital is a sphere. A P orbital is two spheres. That's that duality, the first two, the air and the water. The third one is the D one, and it's kind of a donut in two spheres. So now we're getting more solid, we're getting more physical. And then there's the F orbital, and that's very transcendent. It's kind of abstract, the way that the F orbital looks. That's the quality of the fourth. The fourth always is transcendent. Now, chemists will say that they can make a G orbital. It's never been done, but it's possible. That's that ultra transcendent fifth, that divine, godlike fifth. So all I'm illustrating is that even as we move through these different theories throughout history, we're still seeing that 3+1 pattern is dominant, that quadrant pattern. It expresses itself as dominant, and that's what the quadrant model is saying. Is that that pattern has always been the main pattern.
Okay, so I'm sure someone has probably brought this up, and I actually have to ask, just because it was one of the things that kind of just screamed at me when I first saw it. Was you're talking about these sets of four and whatnot, those 3+1, and you reference the electrolyte content of Powerade.
Yeah.
So what brought that into it? What was the line of thinking on that?
So they called Powerade a complete sports drink. They call it Ion 4 because it has the four ions that you need to replenish yourself. The four electrolytes that you need to replenish yourself from your sweat.
No, the four main ones. Yes, there are others aside from that, but yeah, it's the four that you lose the fastest.
So it's just, again, the point of the quadrant model is to show that this fourfold, that this quadrant pattern is dominant, and that's just another example that we're even seeing it in Powerade. But you're going to see it everywhere, and that's my point.
And see, that's where it comes back to the whole, where I have an issue with it as potentially being an issue of apophenia, because okay, you're seeing this pattern or everywhere, but it comes more across as it's a in logical fallacy terms, it's what would be called a post hoc rationalization. You're saying this, therefore, because of this. So you see where the implication is on that one. Like we'll use power for the example. Okay, so they focus on putting these four electrolytes in, not because of this quadrant model or because of this issue of the cross, but because research shows this is what's lost the fastest, so this needs to be replenished first. So you can see where that's not really a proper implementation of trying to force that pattern onto it. And
I'll give another example of one that someone might look at is I posted also on that quadrantmodel.com website, in and out. And I point out that the in and out trees they always put them in a cross formation. And apparently the person who founded In and Out, I forget what his favorite movie was, but in the movie they have trees that are in a cross formation, so he wanted to make that an aspect of In and Out. And then they cap the number of patties that you can, or the number of meat patties that you can use at 4. So quadruple double is the highest that they'll go to. And then again, you might say, "Oh wow, you're just trying to force things." But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to look at all of the examples of this fourfold pattern, this 3+1 pattern. I'm just pointing out that you're seeing it in so many places. I don't think it's coincidental. I think that there's something pretty profound going on here.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask this one. When it comes to the religious aspect of things, so are you theistic? Do you believe that God exists? And if so, is there a particular religion that you subscribe to with which you would attach this quadrant model to? So do you find as Christian, Buddhist, Muslim? I mean, just...
So the quadrant model is kind of a meta theory. So it's kind of a theory that's so broad it incorporates and transcends all the theories before it. And it even incorporates all of the religions. So this pattern is dominant in Hinduism, it's dominant in Buddhism, in Christianity, and Islam. And even I watched what I've been doing a lot recently is I've been watching teaching company courses. My grandpa, my mom's dad had a lot of videos from this group called the Teaching Company, or the Great Courses. And I discovered the quadrant model. I started just watching those videos just to see how this pattern fit with what these professors were talking about. And that's how I started to kind of see that all the professors were mentioning this quadrant pattern a lot. So what were you discussing again?
I was asking if there was a particular religion that you personally subscribe to.
So in one of the teaching company courses, the professor was saying that there's 4 main world religions. It's Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. And the way I see it is that's just another aspect of the quadrant pattern, where we're seeing Buddhism. To me, that's the air religion. That's the kind of ethereal, mental, not yet physical. Then we have Christianity. Christianity, to me, that's kind of more the water religion. It's more about belief and belonging, but it's not as substantial. It's not as doing oriented. But then you get Islam, which is a lot about doing. It's a lot about action. That's that third religion. The third tends to be more solid, more physical, more action oriented. And to me, that's more Islam. And then Hinduism, the way that I see it is that's the abstract, transcendent fourth religion. The one that also kind of contains the previous 3. That's kind of the quality of the fourth. Is it goes beyond the first 3, but it also has aspects of the first 3. It incorporates qualities of the first 3. So a Hindu will say, hey, the Buddhism, to me, I like the Buddha. The Buddha was a Hindu. I think that it's a great religion. I think the Buddha was an avatar of Vishnu. And then he'll say Jesus. I think that Jesus was, sure, he was the son of God. That's great. And Islam, Muhammad was a great prophet, and he recognized Shiva and Vishnu, or because in our opinion, Shiva and Vishnu are one, and that is Allah. So Hinduism is that kind of transcendent fourth. Now, according to this professor on the teaching company course, he said that Judaism technically is not a world religion, because he said according to most sociologists, a world religion has to be that it encompasses a large area of land and it proselytizes. But Judaism doesn't really proselytize, so that it's not included as a world religion. But that would be that fifth one that's questionable, that ultra transcendent fifth. But so, as you can see, I kind of look at everything through this paradigm, through this prism of the quadrant model. So when it comes to, do you subscribe to any one religion, I just look at it through the quadrant pattern. That's the way that I analyze these religions. How do they fit this quadrant paradigm?
Excuse me, gotta grab some water. So the criticisms I would offer at this point would be, there seems to be an issue with timing when it comes to looking at the world religions. Sorry about that. Because when you look at things from a timeline perspective, we know that Hinduism predates the three Abrahamic religions. And then also Judaism predates Christianity. Christianity predates Islam, although they really kind of popped up around the same time, but there were a few centuries in between. So the question that I have at that point is, why would it not be ordered differently with Hinduism as the outside questionable one as the fifth, since it obviously predates the other four? And also we have to look at the fact that, okay, sure, these are the four most heavily populated religions. These have the most worldwide followers. But you look at Christianity alone, and Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, there's, close to 33,000 separate sects of Christianity at this point, just in general. Islam has at least three that I can think of off the top of my head, the Sunni, the Shia, and the ones that are claimed by neither, the Wahhabis, people who see that as a bastardization of the Islamic faith, because that tends to be where you find the most extreme views. And then Judaism itself has multiple faith doctrines within itself, because you have Orthodox Judaism and you have at least two or three others. So you see where this kind of tends to fall apart once you introduce just the tiniest bit of nuance. I mean, it's okay to have a model just kind of in its fledgling stage, and you're exploring and feeling things like this out, but you have to take into account all of the data and not just pick what feels best. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, the reason why I didn't include Judaism within the first four was because of how the professor described that it's, in his opinion, and in a lot of sociologists' opinion, it's not technically a world religion. That's why I put it as the fifth, that questionable. It's always questionable.
Okay, but why take the opinion of a sociologist over, say, a theologian?
I don't know if he was a sociologist, but it was a course on religion. But he said according to sociologists. So maybe also according to religious scholars.
Okay, so he's a religious scholar that made a statement that sociologists make.
Yeah, and he could have said sociologists and religious scholars. I don't really remember exactly who, but that's what he said.
But still, when you look at sociology, everything in that is subjective, and so to label three as world religions and another as not, is going to be based on ultimately an arbitrary distinction.
Yeah, a lot of stuff. It's not black and white. It's not so. I mean, if you want to say that, make a different, put the different religions in different squares, that's fine. Part of the reason I put Hinduism as the fourth one is because, like I said, it's that one that kind of transcends yet encompasses. And I even talk to people and they'll say Hinduism isn't even really a religion. Hinduism is a philosophy. But then other people say, no, it is a religion. And then Buddhism is that first one, that the reason why I say it's the first one is because it's very mind oriented. It's a lot about sensation and perception awareness, and that's kind of the qualities that are demonstrated by by the first quadrant, the first square, tends to be, like I said, more ethereal. But if you want to say, if you want to put the different religions in different squares, that's fine.
Well, it's not just that. It's just that ultimately there is a lot of questions raised by each positioning or the inclusion of each one. You know, such as, okay, if you're having Christianity as one of your quadrants, what about those sects of Christianity that a lot of people tend to not recognize or tend to distance themselves from when they speak of Christianity, such as Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses. You know, Jehovah's Witnesses being seen by a lot of people outside of that faith as more of a cult. So when you're looking at all these different things, and also back on the topic of Hinduism, Hinduism is definitely a religion. When you look at the Vedic texts, the oh gosh, I can never remember how to pronounce the name of the actual holy book of the Hindus. The closest one I would say to being, I guess, mind-oriented or transcendent would quite possibly be Buddhism, since that's all focused on attaining the essence of nirvana, like the Buddha obtained. But even so, that particular belief system is entirely separate from all these others that you're mentioning, because if you speak to individuals that are actual Buddhists that follow the Eightfold Path, they don't have a deity, because the Buddha is not a deity. He is still just a man who ascended, who gained this nirvana level of oneness with the universe, so to speak. And so you see where something like that tends to not fit. And then when you look at Christianity with all the different sects, okay, is there a particular aspect of Christianity that you're recognizing as occupying that quadrant slot? Because, I mean, I'm sure Michael would definitely attest, Roman Catholicism is far and away worlds different from something like Mormonism or the Jehovah's Witness. Would it not be?
Absolutely. In fact, Christians wouldn't consider Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses actual Christians, so they would be automatically disbarred from the conversation of Christianity. But, to just kind of jump in here with a couple related comments, I think that the notion that there's 33,000 different denominations out there, you hear it repeated very, very often. It's in reference to Protestant denominations, by the way, in contradistinction to Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Oriental Orthodoxy. But it's actually pretty exaggerated, just because there's extremely minor differences between most of those groups, and so you really can't call them different sects or denominations. So I don't think it's really that shattered, although don't get me wrong, I do think that the Protestants are shattered. But I have another comment here, and then perhaps a question. I have a difficulty with this idea that the quadrant module is true, and that God might be the author of it, in giving religion as an example, because when you look at these religions, they're extremely opposed to each other. And so it would seem very inconsistent for God to be the author of these religions. For instance, you have Islam absolutely opposes 100% paganism. There's no way around it. Any kind of paganism, any kind of notion that God is not one and just a absolute undivided one is completely opposed in Islam. And so you also look at Christianity and Islam, entirely opposed. Christianity is built on the idea that the Son of God came to save sinners. And Islam 100% opposes that, because it says God does not have a son, and if you believe that God has a son, you go to hell. So, one is saying you have to believe in the Son of God to go to heaven. The other one is saying if you believe that God has a son, you go to hell. Then you look at Christianity, it's also the fulfillment of Judaism. So it essentially is Judaism after Christ. But if you look at Judaism today and Christianity today, they're entirely opposed to each other. One says that the Messiah came, one says he did not. And then when you look at Christianity's relationship with Hinduism, of course, it's going to be absolutely opposed to it, because Hinduism is again going to teach paganism And of course, Buddhism and Christianity don't really mingle either, just because Buddhism is going to focus on escaping matter, whereas in Christianity, God came into the world, he came into matter to save it and redeem it. And individuals who are redeemed will spend eternity with God in a material body. So these are two opposed views. So I don't see how God could be the author of the quadrant module if you're going to say that the quadrant module is related to religion, because it seems that they're absolutely opposed to each other. And then that's just kind of a comment, maybe if you can respond to it. And then one question that I have, sure, we can find many, many examples in the world of things that are 4 in number. Absolutely. Because it's a very simple number, 1, 2, 3, 4. So how many things are there going to be that, meet that description? Probably a lot. But how many things in the world are going to be in numbers of 2? Binary model. I mean, you have male and female, positive and negative, matter and antimatter, good and evil, with evil being the privation of good. I mean, I can name all kinds of things that come in the form of a trinity, with 3s. Why is 4 selected over really any other number? Why is it favored? So I guess those would be my comments and then questions.
So the thesis behind the quadrant model is basically that this quadrant pattern is dominantly expressed. So in Buddhism, I'll give one example, would be the Four Noble Truths, where the fourth one is different. It's about the Eightfold Path. It doesn't kind of fit with the first 3. In Christianity, one example would be Jesus when he's throwing out the seeds on the earth, and then the fourth seed. Or he says a parable about the seeds being thrown on the earth, and the 4th seed grows, whereas the other 3 don't. That's that 3+1 pattern. And it's a common example. There's 4 schools of Islam, 4 primary schools of Islam. One is kind of different. In Hinduism, an example is 4 primary Hindu denominations. One is they worship Shiva. These are the main ones. One worships Vishnu. Another one worships the mother goddess. Then the 4th one kind of worships 5 gods. Worship these gods. They worship what's called a quincunx pattern.
I have to interrupt at least a little bit here. It sounds like your audio is kind of messing up. You might want to turn the volume down on your laptop a little bit, because it seems like you're getting a bit of a feedback loop when you talk.
Oh, has that been going on this whole time?
There was a tiny bit here and there, but now it's become a bit more pronounced.
Okay. So the 4th one is Hinduism, and Hinduism. Okay, no. And the 4th denomination of Hinduism is they worship 5 gods in a quincunx pattern. A quincunx is 5 parts in a cross pattern. They'll have 4 on the outside and the 5th in the center, making a kind of cross. So all that the quadrant model is saying is that this pattern of the cross is the most pronounced of any pattern in existence. Now, and it's expressing itself in a way that isn't random, that there's some sort of intention behind it. I think that it wants to be recognized as dominant. Now, in terms of when we're talking about the how could God make these different religions if they are opposed to each other? That's a really good question, and I can see how, in one perspective, one vantage point, they do seem extremely opposed to each other. And even according to the quadrant model, they should be opposed to each other, because the first square always has qualities that are different from the third square. The third square is going to be more action-oriented. That's Islam. The first square is going to be more mental-oriented. That's Buddhism. The 4th square is going to be more abstract. That's Hinduism. The second square, it's more nice, homeostasis. That's Christianity. But I also want to say this, that we should be careful before we look at things too stereotypically. Because just because the Wahhabi Muslims say are very fanatical, doesn't mean that every Muslim is that way. So an example would be the Sufi Muslims. They will say, hey, it's not that big of a deal that people are worshiping idols. It's okay when Christians and Catholics worship idols, that's not a big deal. And one way they look at this is they look at a passage in the Quran where Satan refuses to bow to man. Because and they say that Satan actually was an extreme monotheist, but he was too radical of a monotheist. God told him bow to man, but he didn't do it. He was overly fanatical. So that's just one example of a Muslim who's not a Muslim group might not fit within that. Even the Baha'i Muslims, they claim that they use the Quran as their sacred text, as one of their sacred texts. Yet they claim that their Baha'u'llah is an avatar of God. They say that doesn't contradict the Quran, and they say that you can eat pork. That doesn't contradict the Quran. They say that you can drink alcohol. That doesn't contradict the Quran. They say that women don't have to cover their hair. That doesn't contradict the Quran. So these are kind of stereotypical views. And yeah, sure, I agree that there's a lot of Muslims who take extremist views, but it doesn't mean that every Muslim believes that way. And there's a lot of people who claim that they use the Quran, claim to be Muslims, who will look at Buddhism and say, hey, that the Buddha don't contradict our religion, the teachings of Christ. Now, even in Catholicism, I've heard Catholic preachers study the Quran, and they say that there's no contradictions between the Quran and the Bible. One thing that they will say is they'll say, yeah, actually the Quran doesn't contradict the Trinity. Just Muhammad was saying that the mother Mary wasn't an aspect of the Trinity. There's no contradiction there. They'll say, yeah, even the Quran, like for instance the Ishmaeli Muslims, they'll say even the Quran says that does not contradict the idea that Jesus was put on a cross. Now our stereotypical idea behind Islam is that they teach that Jesus didn't die on the cross. That's what a lot of people think that Islam teaches. But there are Muslims like the Ishmaeli Muslims who say that the Quran actually doesn't technically say that. They look at the Quran through a metaphysical perspective, and they say that when the Quran says that Jesus didn't die on the cross, they're saying that Jesus' true self, his divine self, didn't die on the cross, and that actually the true self cannot die, and that's what the Quran was saying. So, when these types of people can even look at Hinduism, they can say there's no contradiction between Hinduism and the Quran. So, for instance, the Hare Krishna, they will look at the Quran and they'll say, yes, Allah is Vishnu. And they don't see any contradictions.
Well, just because they don't see a contradiction doesn't mean that one doesn't exist. For instance, looking in the Quran quite clearly states that the Bible is a corrupted text. But at that point, the Quran also relies very heavily on the Bible to make a lot of its points. So the Quran itself, at least from a doctrinal standpoint or a literary standpoint, seems to fall apart at that particular juncture. It says that the Bible is corrupted, but relies on the Bible to make certain points, and then it says the Quran cannot be corrupted. So at that point, the whole thing falls apart. And I guess I can kind of see what you're saying with a couple of things, but again, you really need to address something that Michael was asking earlier. Why the number 4? Why not 3? Why not 2? Why not 670,851? Because you're right, we can find 4 everywhere, but there are tons of places where I don't find 4. I look at my hand, I have 5 digits on there. I look at my feet, I have 5 digits there. If you want to look at appendages from the torso of the human body, head, 2 arms, 2 legs, that's 5. So I mean, why can't I just say pose a pentagrammatic model of reality and go out and find almost any of these same distinctions in just the same fashion? I could even draw conspiracy theories about the U.S. government from that. The Pentagon, it has 5 sides. That must mean it's part of my pentagrammatic model of reality. So you see that at some point when a model is so basic and so vague that it applies to literally everything without actually directly applying to anything, or at least not anything specific, the model kind of just falls apart. It's a useless model.
And do you mind if I kind of jump in here and make some comments that were addressed as far as religion? Unfortunately, I think that a lot of what you said about religion was inaccurate. At least I'd submit that that's the case. There's a lot of inaccuracies that I would submit, but let me just focus on one in particular. You addressed Islam, and you said that that this was perhaps one of the extreme views that I asserted amongst the Muslims, but I would actually say no, that this denial that God does not have or this assertion that God has no son is in fact straight from the Quran, and this is going to be attested by pretty much every Muslim out there. If you read the Quran itself, it says, and this is Yusuf Ali's version, he says, "Say, praise be to Allah, who begets no son and has no partner in his dominion." Whereas if you look at 1 John 2:3, it says, "No one who denies the Son has the Father. Whoever acknowledges the Son has the Father also." And then 1 John elsewhere goes on to say, if you deny that God does not, or if you say that God does not have a son, you're of the Antichrist. And so these are entirely opposed, and this is not, asserting extreme views. This is just very, very foundational in the texts themselves. And, as far as the Catholic priest that you're, saying that that you were noting that said there's, really no differences between the Bible and the Quran, that's unfortunately reflective of a priest who really doesn't know what he's talking about, because I've read the two and they are very much opposed to each other. If you look at the recounting of just historical events or biblical stories, you look at their accounts of the narrative of Moses or something like that, they're very much opposed to each other in the way that they describe the stories. And that's because the Quran is going to, especially Muslims, they're going to say that the biblical text, as Thomas noted, has been corrupted. And so Islam has come to restore the truth. So I don't think there's any way that you could really make these mesh. So I would say that because of the fact that there are these contradictions, God cannot be the author of these 4 main religions, which I would say is arbitrary, because I can give you 5 or 6 or 7 main world religions. God can't be the author of them because he is not the author of falsehood or contradictions. And they clearly, they clearly oppose each other. They clearly have contradictions. One of them has to be false, at least. And God, of course, can't be the author of falsehood. So I would say that I think that what's going on here is we have the case of what Thomas mentioned as apophenia, where we're looking for 4 and we're trying to jam it into a model that really just isn't working. I think this religion issue is a perfect example. But maybe if you could comment on that.
So the Quadrant Model doesn't argue that one religion is correct or this religion's right or this religion's wrong. The Quadrant Model doesn't have anything to do with that. All the Quadrant Model is looking for is 3 + 1 patterns. And it sees them, the theory is seen in these religions in a lot of places. That's what the Quadrant Model is saying. But in terms of what you're talking about, contradictions, all that I was saying is that there are people who say that there aren't contradictions. And
you'll find people out there who say all kinds of things, though. But I would say those who really look into it, there's no way you're going to come away with that.
Yeah, exactly. There are people out there that, I hate to use this as the trope, but apparently it's become that. There are people out there that flagrantly say that the Earth is flat, and they vehemently believe this. So I'm not trying to compare you to flat earthers here. I'm just saying that to bolster Michael's point is like you can find anyone out there to say virtually anything for one of any number of reasons. Either they potentially have a mental disorder that could make them say such things. They could be hyper religious or extremely fundamentalist in a particular religion, which can be bad depending on how deep that goes. or someone can simply be paid enough, or someone could just be doing it for fun. So you see where that becomes a bit of an issue, relying entirely on something that somebody else says versus collecting actual data. And I get it. It's looking for this 3+1 pattern, except that's the problem with apophenia, is you don't know really what's happening until it's gone on for too long. Okay, you're looking for this 3+1 pattern. Well, there's a great old saying: if you're going to go look for something and you look for it hard enough, you're going to find it. That's not always a good thing.
And but why this notion of 3+1? Because when it comes to religion, because it seems arbitrary. I can name you Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. That's 5. Gnosticism, Sikhism. I mean, these are all still prevalent. I mean, not Gnosticism is very. We can maybe call it New Age these days, but it's essentially the same thing. Why 3+1 when it comes to religion? When to me, I see more than just a 3+1 as far as world religions out there.
And that's just from the
you could totally throw that one example away, and you could say, you know what, I don't agree with that there's 4 world religions. I don't agree. I think there's 7. But I would say, okay, you can believe that, but it still doesn't take away from the fact that the 3+1 pattern is dominant in existence, and that's what the quadrant model is.
So yeah, and I think you can find binary models dominant in existence, or Trinitarian models dominant in existence, and the Christians say that God is a Trinity. So I think that you can find, because these numbers are so low, you can find so many instances of them in creation, and so I guess I'm still not seeing why 4 is special over the others.
So. Thomas mentioned that he said, I have five digits on my hand. So that's one example of that the quadrant pattern doesn't make. That's the quadrant pattern is not true. But then the way that I look at it is, again, it's that 3+1 pattern, and then there's that 5th one that is ultra transcendent. So in terms of the hand, there's actually 4 fingers and a thumb.
True, but now you're shoehorning that. But see, this is exactly why I brought that up, because I wondered if you would do this. This is that apophenia that I'm talking about, or what appears to be apophenia. Because, okay, I said I have 5 digits on my hand. I didn't specify fingers. I didn't specify thumbs. I said I have 5 digits on my hand. Just by saying 5 digits, it already completely invalidates that pattern seeking. But to go in there and say, okay, you have 4 fingers, okay, well, you've got, on most people, 2 that are about the same length, the pointer finger, the forefinger, and then the ring finger. But then you have the one that's longer than all the others, the middle finger, and then, you have your pinky finger, which it does all these different things, and oddly enough, that's actually where the vast majority of your grip strength comes from, is your pinky, not your thumb. But you see where I'm saying that once I just look at things just from an objective perspective, there are 5 protrusions from my hand. Whether I call them digits, fingers, I could call them Liberty gibbets. It doesn't matter. You can't apply. That 3+1 model doesn't apply unless you force it.
Yeah, because here you have 4 opposed to 1 instead of 3 opposed to 1. So it doesn't fit the model.
So all I have to say is look at my websites and look at all the examples. But in terms of the hand, the way I look at it is, remember, the first one is always most ethereal. It's the least physical. That's the pinky. The second one is not yet physical. It's kind of the intermediate. That's this ring finger. It's not really that dexterous. It's not that good at doing things. The middle finger is that most physical one, the biggest one. That's always the nature of the third one. It's the most solid, most physical. The 4th one, that transcendent index one, I guess you could point. And then those are the 4 fingers. I admit there's 5 digits, but there's 4 fingers, and then there's the thumb, which isn't a finger. So, but my point is that it's all about the pattern. It's not about the number, it's about that pattern. So I'll just give one example, would be the standard model of particle physics. We actually have 16 types of particles, but the particles make up at 3 plus 1 pattern. So the first 4 particles are the down quark, that's the duality. That's the air and the water. Then we have the electron, which is Steward. That's the one. And then we have the electron neutrino. That's that transcendent fourth one, the fire. And the electron neutrino can transform itself into an up or down quark electron. So that's that transcendent fourth that is separate but contains aspects of the first 3.
Okay, so before going any further in this, I actually have to correct you on something. There's not 16 elementary particles in physics. There's actually 17. And they're also not geared up in this 3 plus 1 pattern. The only one you could maybe argue that for would be the gauge bosons, the vector bosons. You've got the gluon, the photon, the Z, and the W boson. But when you look at quarks and leptons, these are in sets of 6.
So
you have up and down quark, charm and strange quark, top and bottom quark, but then with the leptons, it's also 6. So that 3 plus 1 pattern just immediately goes out the window. And then because you have electron, muons, taus, electron neutrinos, muon neutrinos, and tau neutrinos. And then you have this 17th elementary particle, the Higgs particle, which is a scalar boson. And so you see where I'm coming from when I say that you're forcing this pattern into places where it doesn't actually work, because then you have all those same things on the antimatter side of things, as far as we know. So that means that there's 34 elementary particles. You have your matter particles and your antimatter particles. At that point, this model goes completely out the window, because 6 isn't divisible by 4. It's not 16, it's 17. And in fact, it may not even be 17, it may be 34 once you take into account antimatter particles. So again, this model breaks down the second you apply the slightest bit of nuance to it. And I'm afraid I can't let that aspect of it go.
So I'm going to explain the standard model of particle physics in terms of this model, and I think that should probably be good for this discussion. But the standard model of particle physics in terms of the 3 plus 1 pattern, let me explain. So there's families of particles. So the first family, there's 3 families of fermions, and you're right, there are 6 leptons and there's 6 quarks. But these 6 leptons and 6 quarks are in 3 families. And these 3 families are the 3, and then there's a 4th group, a 4th family, which is the bosons, which is that plus 1.
But so those aren't actually families. Those are generations. You're talking about what you're talking about are fermions. And yes, there are 3 fermions in both quarks and leptons, but again, at that point, each one of those fermions only consists of 2 quarks or 2 leptons, these pairs, either an electron or electron neutrino for leptons, or charm quark and strange quark for quarks. Now, we're getting into physics, which is something I'm actually pretty well versed in. And so this is the field that you're not going to get away with anything on, at least not with me. And
so let me explain to you how I see it fitting this pattern, and then just let me explain it, and then after I explain it, then you can I'll tell you when I'm done explaining it, and then you can say if you agree with it or not. But so the first, you're right, they're called generations. So the first generation particles is the up quark, down quark, electron, neutrino. Those are 4. So they're in groups of 4. The guy who discovered this. What's his name? Murray Gell-Mann. He has a quote that I put in one of my on one of my websites where he says, "I don't know why the particles in the standard model are organized in groups of 4. That's just the way it is. Nobody knows why." I say I know why. It's because that's the way that reality is organized everywhere. So the first generation, which is a group of 4, is the up quark, the down quark, the electron, and the electron neutrino. Now that actually is all of our reality. our reality is just made up of 4 particles. Those 4. The up quark and down quark make up protons and neutrons. So if you get two up quarks and a down quark, that'll make a proton. You get two down quarks and one down quark and 2 up quarks. I don't know, and that'll make a neutron. So those make up protons and neutrons. Then you have the electron, an electron neutrino. Those 4 particles are all of our existence. But there's 2 more generations of particles. The second generation of particles, which is another group of 4, is the charm quark and the strange quark. Again, those are the 2 quarks. Then there's 2 leptons. This is why you say that there's 6 quarks and 6 leptons. But again, I'm saying that there are 3 groups of 4. So it's the charm quark, the strange quark, the muon, and the muon neutrino. Those are the 4 particles of the second generation.
Right.
The third generation is the top quark, the bottom quark, the tau, and the tau neutrino. So we have the first 3 generations, 3 groups of 4. There's one more group of 4. Those are the 4 bosons: the gluon, the photon, the Z boson, and the W boson. Now that's that 3+1 pattern because we have 3 groups of 4 fermions and then 1 group of 4 bosons. So 3 plus 1. Now you were mentioning the Higgs boson. That's that one that transcends the quadrant. That's godlike. That's why they call it the God particle. Remember, I told you at the beginning that there's 4. 4th is transcendent, and the 5th is questionable and godlike. Now the Higgs boson completely fulfills that. It's called God particle. It's transcendent, divine, and it's questionable because this is important. It's not for certain that there is a Higgs boson. People think that there's evidence that there is, but it's not certain at this point. That's always the nature of the one that transcends the quadrant of that ultra. So there's 4 times 4, 16 particles that are for certain, and then the Higgs boson, that ultra transcendent God particle.
Actually, so, there's another correction that I have to offer here is that the Higgs boson has actually been confirmed. Was discovered by Peter Higgs and Francois Englert on December 10th of 2013, and they were actually awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for this. Also,
but they're actually not for certain though.
If we are going to say that this 3+1 model applies by looking at the standard model of elementary particles, I have to say it still kind of breaks down because the second you look inside, I can see that. As soon as you look inside the fermions, as soon as you look inside the fermions, it's 2 and 2. So there's still 4, but that 3+1 completely goes away. It's not 3 quarks and a lepton, it's 2 quarks and 2 leptons. So that 3+1 model completely breaks down again. And then you have the Higgs scalar boson, which is a single particle outside of your gauge bosons, which is completely outside the fermions of matter. And they're not, they intermingle, but they're not the same thing. Because the fermions, the quarks and the leptons, those are the generations of matter. Those are what make up matter. Your gauge bosons and scalar bosons, those are just interactions. Those are force carriers. You should be able to see that. I think I saw that word force carrier.
That's exactly the point, is the first 3 groups are similar, but the 4th is transcendent. That's always the nature of the quadrant pattern. That's the thing. The first 3 groups are fermions, and then the 4th group is the bosons, which doesn't fit. That's what Aristotle said, that the first 3 elements are similar, but then the 4th element doesn't fit with them. Fire. So the bosons are like the fire. That's the quadrant pattern.
Except that you can't eliminate the possibility of things like gravitons, which that actually is a theoretical particle, or perhaps
again, it's questionable. It's not for certain. The only for certain ones are those 16 that make a 4x4 matrix, and that's what the quadrant model is. It's a 4x4 matrix.
But look, I think even if you can find instances of 3 and 1 equaling 4, okay, but I can find many instances of 2 and 3 and 5. So at the end of the day, I just don't see 4 having this special position.
I really don't either.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't either because, I mean, the Higgs, no, that particular thing, the Higgs field is scalar, but the boson itself, it doesn't have any spin. There are so many things we know about the Higgs boson. It's not questionable. We've confirmed the existence of this particle. So again, we have that 17 and it breaks everything down. So I think for today, we're going to go ahead and call the show. We've gone on for a little over an hour, and I try to keep these not going for too terribly long. So Ryan, it was a pleasure having you on. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thanks again for tuning in, everybody. Michael, would you like to go ahead and give yourself a shameless plug?
Oh, yeah, sure. ReasonandTheology.com, and you can also find the show on YouTube. Just type in Reason and Theology.
Yes, and for anybody wanting to take a look at what Ryan's got, I'll put in a plug for him as well. The most reliable website currently is probably quadrantmodel.com. If you want to look at the other one, it is quadrantmodelofreality.com. And of course, if you're watching, this is the Atheist Reformation. I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and thanks for tuning in.
All right.